Hey friends, this is the Miss Volfie from Our Half Acre Homestead, and today we're going to start part one of a simple tied log cabin quilt. Okay, this is what a log cabin quilt looks like. For some reason, the first couple of takes, I didn't realize my camera wasn't recording. So I'm going to run you through what I did at first. A log cabin quilt is made of two sets of contrasting shades in fabric. In this case, it is whites and blues, sort of. Now, this is one of my blocks, which I'm going to take you through making. Now, with a log cabin quilt, you basically start with a contrasting color for your hearthstone, and you build upon it, going around and around and around with strips of fabric until you have what looks like a triangle of dark fabric and a triangle of light fabric. And when they're sewed together, they make this pattern, or whatever pattern you want to put them together in. Now, for this log cabin quilt, obviously, I have chosen browns and greens with a red center block. We call that the hearthstone. This is the most important part of your quilt, the cutting. Because what happens is, if your fabric is not perfectly straight, then you're going to have issues later on down the road. So now I have a nice straight seam down here, a folded seam, and I'm going to take the first cut. This is just for demonstration purposes. I am going to take the first cut, and how I make sure that this is really, really square is that I take my folded seam and I line it up with the line on the ruler, and then I just cut it right off. That means now that is perfectly square. Then we're going to slide our ruler up to exactly 2.5 inches. And again, keep your line of your ruler and the line of your measurement so that they are exactly square. That way, when you unfold your fabric, it doesn't matter what the ends say, this is perfectly straight with no wonky zigzags in it. You're going to leave all your light strips and dark strips in nice long strips because this is a strip quilt, okay? It's made with strips. Now going back to our lovely straight strip, we've still got it folded in half. We're going to line up, let me see if I can get you a little closer here. We are going to line up the edge of the fabric, and you want it to be laid down perfectly straight with the line on your ruler. And again, we're going to cut so that the edge of your fabric is lined up, and so it is across the top, making your strips perfectly square. Then again, we're going to go, this is the only one you pre-cut in squares, because this is our center square, and there they are. Perfect 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch center block squares. Okay? The rest you're going to leave in nice piles of strips. Okay, so I have about 10 yards here. So now it's all cut in strips, and remember folks, be really accurate with your cutting. It makes your sewing together in the end so much easier. So let's get started on our simple tied log cabin. Okay folks, we start with our small squares. These are our center squares, and it's usually a contrasting color to what you're working with. And I'm going to start with dark because these are shorter pieces of fabric, and you will be building your block just like a log cabin. The farther along you get, the bigger it gets. So we start with our short pieces first. And this is really simple, folks. Once you learn how to work with strips of fabric for quilts, it gets so much easier. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take one of our pieces of fabric. Here, let me show you here. And for the benefit of you folks, I will pin it the first time. I don't normally pin my fabric because, well, I've just been around about it for a long time. It's longer than I thought. Okay, so here we have a nice piece of fabric, and here are our starter blocks. Now we're going to take our starter blocks and we're going to start sewing them right sides of work facing to our first strip of fabric. Now, just for the benefit of you folks, I'm going to pin these together so that you can see what I'm doing. And what we're going to do is, as we go along, we're just going to sew all these red blocks to the strip, leaving just enough space in between the blocks for your rotary cutter. You don't need to draw a sewing line on your fabric if you're using a sewing machine, and you can go by one of these little cut-ins on your plate. But once you decide which one you're going to use, that's the one you have to use throughout the entire project. Because remember, cutting and sewing has to be precise in order for you to have a nice square quilt. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take our strip and we're going to drop our presser foot down, and we are going to sew. Okay, now what we have now is all these strips of fabric with our foundation block sewn to them. And all we have to do now is cut them apart. If your gap between your foundation blocks is too big, then you're going to want to trim it because it has to be the same size as your foundation block. See, so we're just going to take that right to the edge and trim that little bit off. Be really careful, folks. Don't cut your foundation block. Okay? So when I'm done, this is what it's going to look like. And now we take our blocks and we iron them open. Now, folks, you may think that this is not an important step, but it is. If you want your fabric to lay nice and flat when you sew the next strip on, you want your seams and your blocks pressed flat. It just makes the sewing and the squaring up so much easier. Now, this is called a log cabin because you build on all around the outside one kind of log at a time. But the way this works is you have dark on two sides and then light on two sides. So since we started with the dark next to the hearthstone, we're going to now, the next one has to be perpendicular to the other dark blocks. So all I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to line the fabric up. You can pin it if you like. If you're new at this, I strongly recommend you pin it. But I work better with less restrictions on me. So we line it up. And then you line it up to where your cutting seam is. And we are just going to sew this to the next strip. Now you can see why I use the shorter dark strips first, because as your block gets bigger, you're going to need longer strips. And when I have all of my pieces sewn to strips. We'll be back. Okay, now, what I should have done before, folks, is I made a mistake. It's been a while. These are my squares, which have now been sewed onto the next strip. And before I cut them, I'm going to iron them open. I don't know why I didn't remember this. This makes things so much easier. Once your block has been ironed open, it makes it so much easier to cut. You line up the edge of your outside of your block to a line on your ruler, and then bring your ruler just to the edge of your last cut fabric. You don't want to be recutting this fabric. You just want to cut the strip that it is attached to. Just like that. And there we go. Our blocks are all done their first double row of darks. Now, this is important for you to notice, okay? Because it's always done in twos. So here we have our center block, and then we have dark going one way and dark going another. Now we're going to go light and light. So let's get on with the first light row. And we're just going to continue to do this exactly the way we started. The only thing that can get tricky is when you are not paying attention to which way your direction is going, and we're going to want light, light, and then dark, dark. These need to be right sides facing, so your pattern is up. And this is the way we want it to go, because there's the center block. Okay, and again, we're always going to use the same measurement for every single time. Let me see if I can get you guys a little bit closer. And that our fabric is either pinned precisely in place or held precisely in place. Now, I've just set this on the white fabric, but I've put a pin through all the layers just so that I can do this one-handed and show you while holding the camera. My fabric is lined up to the edge of the presser foot. It is precisely lined up with the fabric underneath, and its right sides of work facing. And then I'm just going to run it all the way down to the next one. Rinse and repeat. Okay, so now we're going to do our second light strip. Now the way you're going to see this work its way out, you can see this as it's just resting there against it. It's going to be, there's your center, what we call the hearthstone of the log cabin quilt, is your very first square. That's why we like it a contrasting color, so that we can build around it. Okay, so we have dark, dark, and now we're going to have light, light. And as long as you always have two sides dark and two sides light, and they equal in number, your block will be square. Okay, so as you can see here, we have lined it up on the sewing machine. There's our hearthstone, and this is the last time you're going to use your hearthstone block as your guide. And it's up against the second layer of light. Now, the reason this is the last time we're going to use our hearthstone as a guide is because it will now be completely surrounded by the logs, so to speak. And again, if you have problems with sewing straight, as many beginners do, folks, I've been at this a long time. You should always pin the seams of your block so that it's always flush and straight to your fabric. And again, you can see I'm using the presser foot as my sewing guide. And remember, always have your blocks facing in the same direction that you're sewing every time. So we have dark, hearthstone, light. So the next one is, of course, going to be dark, hearthstone light. It's the only way to be positive that your blocks are going in the right direction. Okay, folks, I'm almost done cutting, but I want to show you something. I have 2 piles going here. Now, I thought I needed more, but really all I need is 2, because the next piece of fabric is going to go on this side. It's going to be another dark, and as you can see, these are both prints, and on every one of these blocks we're going to butt up against a solid, either here or here. There's a solid, there's a solid, and the reason I'm putting these in 2 piles is so that when I go to sew on the next piece, this pile I can pick up. If I'm sewing on a solid piece, I'll just pick from this pile. Or if I'm working with a print, I'll pick from this pile. I know I'm a little OCD about prints and solids, but I mean, when it comes right down to it, you'll know what I'm talking about when I start putting it together, so we don't have solids up against solids. And all I have to do is choose whether to choose, or to decide whether to choose brown or green. Depending, see, this bugs me. This bugs me. You know, and it only happened for a couple of blocks, but it does bug me. So here are the prints that I have laid out for this set of blocks. Remember, I told you it's just going whatever has either here or here as a solid, and that way all I have to do, whoops, let's just pick one block. All I have to do is pick the print that I'm going to use next, according to how it's going to look to the block. Obviously, I'm not going to use that one because that one's there. I'm going to sew these strips on the outside here, and every time you add a section and a right angle section, which is 1 strip and 1 strip, you end up with a square. So, I mean, every time it's all your block, if you're doing this right, your block is always going to be square. Right now, it's a rectangle because I still have one more strip to do. Okay, here is one of our blocks that has the last band of dark on it, and we're going to be, once I have these all cut up, because you see these need to be trimmed flush, then we're going to start with the last of the light colors, and I'm not going to take you through that because you've seen enough to know what I'm going to be doing. But the first light one is going to have to go on the one where it's got the shortest light one. See how this one's bigger? So this is the side we do first, and I'm just going to lay fabric down so that you can see how I go. So once I sew a light colored fabric down all the sides of this, and then I iron them out and I trim them, then I'm going to take another light fabric and sew it on there. Now you get to see what I'm talking about when we talk about how it looks almost triangular. You've got a half a block that's dark and a half a block that's light. All right, so I'm going to get back to work, and when I have all these blocks together, I'm going to show you, that'll probably be the end of part 1. Now, as you can see, I have finished my blocks. And you can tell that they look like they are almost diagonally cut in half between light and dark. Okay, we have around our center hearthstone, which I deliberately made in an offset color so you could see. We have 2 dark here and 2 dark here, 2 light here and 2 light here. And we're going to iron these, and we will be ready for step 2. This is the Mrs. Volfie from Our Half Acre Homestead saying stay tuned for part 2 of our simple tied log cabin quilt. Take care. Bye-bye.